Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The Honorable Miss Mutmaina MPD and all of my beloved friends. We are from Group 1 and today we will present about experimental research. But before that, let me introduce our member. They are me, Noka Romadona, and Nur Kholiza Eka Saputri, and then Nur Laila. Experimental research is one of the most powerful research methodologies that researchers can use. Of the many types of research that might be used, the experiment is the best way to establish cause and effect relationship among variables. And then the experimental research have the unique. So the uniqueness of experimental research, it is the only type of research that directly attempts to influence as a particular variable, and then when properly applied, it is the best type for testing hypotheses about cause and effect relationship. Here, there is a independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variables in experimental research is also frequently referred to as the experimental or treatment variable, and the dependent variable, also known as the criterions or outcome variables, refers to the result or outcomes of the study. And then the major characteristic of experimental research. The major characteristic of experimental research that distinguishes it from all other types of research is that researchers manipulate the independent variable. They decide the nature of the treatments, that is, what is going to happen to the subject of the study and to whom it is to be applied and to what the extent. So in this experimental research, the independence variable frequently manipulates in educational research. In educational research include methods of instruction, type of assignment, learning materials, rewards given to students, and types of questions that asked by teacher. And for the dependence variables that are frequently studied include achievement, interest in subject, and then attention spans, motivations, and attitudes toward the schools. What's the purpose of the experimental research? The purpose of the experimental research is the researchers want to see whether the treatment makes a difference. So we use experimental research is to know the treatment that we made is make a difference. And next, some actual example of the kinds of experimental studies. Here there is an example that use experimental studies. The first one is the effect of small classes on instruction and the effect of early reading instruction on growth rates of at-risk kindergarteners, and the use of intensive mentoring to help beginning teachers develop balanced instruction. The effect of lectures on web survey response rates and introductions of a course on bullying into pre-supervised teacher training curriculum. And then the using social stories to enhance the interpersonal conflict resolution skills of children with learning disabilities, and improving the self-concepts of students through the use of hypnosis. And then there is an essential characteristic of experimental research, and the essential characteristic here consists of three. The first one is comparisons of groups, and then manipulations of the independence variable, and randomization. Okay, first we will discuss about comparisons of group. In comparisons of group, the control or the comparison group is crucially important in all experimental research, for it enables the researcher to determine whether the treatment has had an impact or whether one treatment is more effective than another. An experimental research usually involves two groups of subjects, that is, an experimental group and control or comparisons group. The experimental group receives treatments of some sort, such as a new textbooks or a different method of teaching, while the control group receives no treatment, or the comparisons group receives different treatment. For the experimental group, it's two treatment, but for the control group, there is no treatment. And then next, there is manipulations of independence variables. It means that the researcher deliberate and directly determines what form the independence variables will take, and then which group will get which forms. And here, although many independent variable and educations can be manipulated, and then also there is independent variables that cannot be manipulated. In here, the independent variable that can be manipulated include teaching methods, type of counseling and learning activities, assignment given, and material that used. And also, for the independence variable that can be manipulated include the gender, ethnicity, age, and religious reference. Researchers can manipulate the kind of learning activities to which students are exposed in the classroom, but the researchers cannot manipulate the religious and also the age of the students. And then to manipulate a variable, researchers must decide who is to get something and when, where, and how they will get it. The independent variable is an experimental study may be established in several ways. Either the first one is one forms of the variable versus another, and then presence versus absence of a particular forms, or varying degrees of the same forms. For the number one, it would be a study comparing the inquiry method with the lecture method of instructions in teaching chemistry. And for the number two, it would be a study of comparing the use of PowerPoint slide versus no PowerPoint slides. And then for number three, would be the study of comparing the impact of different spatial amount of teacher enthusiasms on students' attitude toward mathematics. And then next, there is a randomization. The randomization consists of two. The first one is random assignment, and the second one is random selection. For the random assignments means that every individual who is participating in an experiment has an equal chance of being assigned to any of the experimental or control conditions of being compared. And then the random selections is every member of a population has an equal chance of being selected to be a member of the samples. And then there is three things should be noted about the random assignment of subject to group. The first one is it takes place before the experiment begins. Um, it is and then the second is it is a process of assigning or distributing individuals to group, not a result of such distribution. This means that you cannot look at two groups that have already been formed and be able to tell just by looking whether or not they were formed randomly. And third, the use of random assignments allow the researchers to form a group that rank at the beginning of the study are equivalent, and that is they differ only by chance in any variable of interest. And then next there is a control of extraneous variables. They determines the treatment or treatment selects the sample, assign individuals to group, decide which group will get the treatment, try to control other factor beside the treatment that might influence the outcomes of the study, and then observes or measure the effect of the treatment on the groups where the treatment is complete. And here there is how do researchers minimize or eliminate traits due to subject characteristic. The first one, there is a randomization that as we mentioned before, that each subject can be randomly assigned to the various group involved in an experimental study. The researchers can assume that the groups are equivalent. This is the best way to ensure that the effects of one or more possible extraneous variable have been controlled. And then the second one, there is a holding certain variable constant. In here, the idea is to eliminate the possible effect of variable by removing it from the study. For example, if a researcher suspects that the gender might influence the outcomes of the study, she could control for it by restricting the subject of the study to female and by excluding all males. The variables of gender, in other words, is a held constant. However, there is a cause involved. And then for the buildings, the variables into the design. Distillation involves building the variables into the study to assess their effect. And it is the exact opposite of the previous idea. And then here there is a matchings. In matching, often pairs of subjects that can be matched on certain variable of interest. If a researcher feel that age, for example, might impact of the outcomes of the study, he makes under over to match students according to their age, and then assign one member to each pair. And then next, using subject as their own control. When subjects are used as their own controls, their performance under both treatment is compared. And using analysis of covariance, it is the analysis that can be used to equate group statically on the basis of the pretest or other variable. The post-test scores of the subject in each group are the ages accordingly. Okay, I think that's all for me. Thank you for your attention. And the next material will be explained by Nur Kholiza Eka Saputri.
Okay, so thank you for the moderator. Next, we have to continue and discuss about group designs in experimental research. Okay, so what is the definition of that design? The design of an experiment can take a variety of forms. Some of the design that we have present in this section it is better than others. Why better? Because of the various traits to internal validity and identified. So the quality of an experiment depends on how well the various traits to internal validity are controlled. Okay. And then in this chapter we have 4 contents in here. The first one is poor experimental design. The second one is quasi-experimental design. The third one is true experimental design. And then the last one is factorial design. Okay, so we have to discuss one by one. The first one is poor experimental design. So this design are do not have built-in controls for traits to internal validity, and in addition to the independent variable, there are a number of other explanations for any outcomes that occur, and then as a result, any researcher who use one of this design has difficulty. And then the weakness of this design, it is absence of any control, and then the researchers has no way of knowing if the result obtained, and then the design does not provide for any comparison. Okay. In this design there are many studies that expert can argue. For the first one is the one-shot case. Okay. In this study, it is depend on a single group is exposed to treatment or event, and a dependent variable is subsequently. So as you can see, there is the design that we have. The first one is X as a treatment, and then O as the observation dependent of variable. And then the one group pre-test post-test design. Okay, so in this design, a single group is measured or observed not only after being exposed to treatment of some sort, but also before of the treatment. So the diagram of this design is follows. As you can see, O as a pretest, and then X as a treatment, and then O as a post-test. So it's combined of three tests in here. Okay, so consider an example of this design. A principal wants to assess the effect of weekly counseling session, and then this design is better than one-shot case study because the researchers at least knows whether any change occurred, but it's still weak. Okay, and then we go to the next chapter, that is true experimental design. So what is the definition of that design? That this design is the essential of ingredient of a true experimental design is that subjects are randomly, and then it is a treatment based on a groups. And then there are many group design in this study. For the first one is the randomized post-test, and then only control group design. So in this design, both of which are formed by random assignment. As you can see, there are the design, the treatment group RXO, and then the control group RCO. Okay, so the next one is the randomized pretest after the post-test control group design. So this design, it is differs from the randomized post-test only control designed solely in the use of a pretest. And then as you can see, there are the table in here. It is the example of a randomized post-test only control group design. Okay. So in the random assignment with a matching, there are two matching in here. The first one is mechanical matching. The second one is statistical matching. Mechanical matching, it is the process of pairing two persons whose scores on a particular variable are similar. And then the next is statistical matching. Does not a lot of subject, but it is a limit a number of matching variable. So the subject is given a predicted score on a dependent variable based on the correlation between dependent variable and then the subject, like that. Okay, so this design do not include the use of random assignment. So the researchers who employ this design really instead to other technique to control. We shall describe some of this technique, and then we discuss about the matching only design, the counterbalance design, and then also have time series design. There are many typically of design in this study. So the last one is factorial design. So the definition of this design is extend the number of relationships that may be examined in an experimental study. They are essentially modified quotient, and then which permit the investigation of additional independent variable, and then of another value of a factor in this design is the researchers study the interaction of independent variable and then sometimes call the moderator variable. Okay, so this is the table that we can practice in here, and then if it is not really good explanation, you can open your book to understand it is. Okay, so thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, in here I would like to continue the presentation. It's about evaluating the likelihood of a threat to internal validity in experimental studies. Okay, an important consideration in planning an experimental study or in evaluating the results of a report study is the likelihood of threat to internal validity. As we have shown, a number of possible threats to internal validity may exist. The question that the researcher must ask is how likely is it that any particular threat exists in this study? Okay, to aid in assessing this likelihood, there are some criteria there are 3 steps in here. Step 1, ask what specific factors either are known to evaluate the dependent variable or may logically to expect it to evaluate this variable. And then step 2, ask what is the likelihood of the comparison groups differing on each of these factors. And step 3 is evaluate the traits on the basis of how likely they are to have an effect and plan to control for them. If a given trait cannot be controlled, acknowledge this. Okay, and in here there are the guidelines for handling internal validity in comparison group studies. Okay, actually this is related to step 2. Okay, the importance of step 2 is illustrated in these pictures. Okay, I mean diagram. It is like thermometers. Okay, the performance of subject receiving method A compared to those receiving method B. In diagram A, subject receiving method A perform higher on the post-test but also perform higher on the pre-test. Thus, the differences in pre-test achievement accounts for the differences on the post-test. In diagram B, subject receiving method A performed higher on the post-test but didn't perform higher on the pre-test. Thus, the post-test result cannot be explained by or attributed to different achievement levels prior to receiving the methods. Okay, next is control of experimental treatments. The design discussed in this chapter actually all intended to improve the internal validity of an experimental study. As we have seen in previous explanation from another presenters, each has its advantages and also disadvantages, and each provides a way to handling some traits. And then of course, an essential requirement of a well-conducted experiment is that the researchers have control over the treatment. That is, they control the what, who, when, and how of it. In here there are clear example of researcher control is the testing of new drug. Okay. The drug is treatment and the researcher can control who administer it and then under what condition, when it is given, to whom, and how much. Okay, next is an example of experimental research. In here there are some criteria that we can use to selecting the study for review. The first is the study has to exemplify typical but not outstanding methodology and permit constructive criticism. And the study had to have enough interest value to hold the attention of students, even though specific professional interests may not be directly addressed. And the last is the study had to be consistently reported. And then next, in criticizing each of these studies, we can use a series of categories and questions that should by now be familiar to you. They are the first, purpose or justification. We can use some questions such as, is it logical? Is it convincing? Is it sufficient? Do the authors show how the results of the study have important implications for theory, practice, or both? Are assumptions made explicit? Next is definition. Are major terms clearly defined? If not, are they clear in context? And then prior research. We can use question, Has previous work on the topic been covered adequately? Is it clearly connected to the present study? And then hypothesis. Are the state implied appropriate for the study? Next is sample. What type of sample is used? Is it a random sample? Is it the random sample? If not, is it adequately described? Do the authors recommend it or imply generalizing to a population? If so, is the target population clearly indicated? Are possible limits to generalizing discussed? Next is instrumentation. Is it adequately described? Is evidence of adequate reliability presented? Is evidence of validity provided? How persuasive is the evidence of the argument for validity of inferences made from the instruments? And then procedures or internal validity. What truths are evident? Were they controlled? If not, were they discussed? Next is data analysis. We can use some question like, are data summarized and reported appropriately? Are descriptive and inferential statistics used appropriately? And are the statistics interpreted correctly? Are limitations discussed? Next is results. Are they clearly presented? Is the written summary consistent with the data reported? And then the last is discussion and interpretations. Do the authors place the study in a broader context? Do they recognize limitations of the study, especially with regard to population and ecological generalizing of results? So we can use some of these questions to criticizing each of the study. We can use some series of categories of this question. Okay, I think that's all for my explanation. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.